All right, Charles from GMAT Ninja still here. Welcome to hour number 14 of our nonstop GMAT crash course marathon. Hour number 14 here, we're going to get back to sentence correction. I've been kind of looking forward to doing this one for a while. So we're going to talk about pronouns. And I think might have been the first video I did on the GMAT Club channel was, I think, on pronouns. It was one of the maybe first 4 or 5, might have been the very first one. 100 and something thousand views later. I made a bunch of mistakes in that video. I think there were some things that I kind of presented with rigidity. And as much as I've always preached flexibility and kind of the intuition and the meaning in sentence correction, I made some mistakes in that video. And I kind of want to go at that again here now and frame things for the most part in similar ways, but a few things I'm going to do just a little bit differently. So as we think about pronouns, we can get really, I don't know, the temptation is to get super mechanical with it. And sometimes that can have value to kind of say, well, hey, if you see a singular pronoun, you're looking for a singular noun somewhere. Okay, great. Fair enough. If there's no singulars, you have a problem. Fair enough. Those are the foundations. Excuse me, pretty basic stuff. But then you kind of get into stuff like, well, where do you look exactly and how close does it need to be and what does ambiguity do? And one of the things that I really emphasized in the first version of a pronoun video is ambiguity is not an absolute rule. It's something you should look out for. If your only 2 decision points, you're down to 2 answer choices, one has an ambiguous pronoun, one does not, and there's nothing else to go off of, I picked the one that's not ambiguous, right? But not an absolute rule. You shouldn't cross it out automatically because it's ambiguous. There are actually a couple things I got into where I was a little bit rigid with it, and I kind of regret that. And that is going to be kind of fun for me here. So I'm going to go through a few of these. And again, remember on sentence correction, always, 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 what does good hygiene look like? Get your definite errors first, things that you can look at and say, I know that one's wrong, cross it out. That's your route to efficiency. Take your remaining answer choices and think through meaning on those and find those little differences and try to figure out what do those do. All right, let's get to it. Part of what makes me happy here, and I realize that some of this stuff I'm saying is of way less interest if you're watching this after the fact. But this block is sponsored once again by Applicant Lab. Maria Witchvilla, one of my favorite people in the industry here. She's here answering questions with us on the live chat. I love it. So having a nice back and forth with actually a guy that's a now recovered successful GMAT Ninja student, and I'm really enjoying watching kind of the back and forth, seeing a lot of disagreement on this particular question. Real quick before I get into this question, tell a quick little story about Maria. All good stories. So I think I was joking in the other block she sponsored about, GMAT Club will say, hey, Charles, do you want to, moderate a panel? No. Maria will be on it. I'm like, yeah, okay, that'll be fun then. Now, I have a good friend, won't name names here, who paid for a pretty high-priced admissions consultant, kind of conventional consultant. And to paraphrase and remove the expletives, he later said, yeah, it was useless, and I'm removing a lot of his favorite words from there. And met Maria, worked with Applicant Lab in kind of its earlier days, and has told me over and over again how much he got out of that he didn't get out of the full consultant experience, the full expensive experience. And just the depth of her knowledge and advice, absolutely fantastic. Harvard graduate, one of my favorites. Maria, not judging your mistakes on the sentence correction, but love what you're doing over at Applicant Lab. Go check it out. Free trial is available. Doesn't hurt to get in there way before you're done with your GMAT. Go kind of think about how you might start framing this stuff. Doesn't hurt to get your brain working. Doesn't hurt to kind of see what products are out there, what kind of price. So big fan of Applicant Lab. Maria, thank you again for having our backs on the fundraiser. All right. Sentence correction. Is that what this one's about? I'm getting sleepy. What are we talking about here? We're talking about sloths and their long rubbery limbs. So sentence correction, what's it about? Noticing the things that are going to help you. That first step, find the definite errors, find them efficiently. That's what we're going after here. Non-underlined portion, buried way at the end. And this came up in a bunch of our lessons today on other things where it's like parallelism. Yeah, your trigger might be way in the non-underlined portion and you don't even see it. Happens all the time. That's why this is one of my favorite questions. Once you learn to look for the right things, this is totally mechanical, really, really clean question. But it is really easy to miss this stuff because it's buried, 30, 35 words in here. So its coat, its toes, A, B, and C are out immediately. Can't be sloths. Got to be sloth singular, which is getting harder and harder to say as I get more sleep deprived. The sloth singular, its coat, its toes, fantastic. So now we're down to 2. And now, okay, what's different between these two? And I'm seeing some great comments in the live chat. Oh, how did I miss this? Like, yeah, that's the deal. We aren't inclined to look at it. So again, it's not that GMAT's trying to get you with this stuff, but when something's in bold in real life, your eyes go to that and you're going to kind of maybe sort of lightly skim over the rest of it. That's part of how, again, the GMAT's not out to get you with it, but bold-faced questions on CR, that's kind of the mind game, right? Is your eyes go to the thing that's in bold. Sentence correction, your eyes go to the thing that's in the answer choices, go to things that's underlined. It's natural, right? That's what we do. It's underlined, must be important. So it's really easy to miss this stuff. So the way I want you to think about it is these things that can get you easy eliminations, pronouns, parallelism, certain kinds of modifiers. I want those to jump off the page no matter where you see them. Underline, underline doesn't matter. Got to jump off the page. You scan for those first. Doesn't matter where they are. Okay. The sloth hangs by its limbs, sleeping 15 hours a day and moving so infrequently that 2 species of algae grow on its coat and between its toes. And that 15 hours of sleep sounds absolutely wonderful. And E, the sloth, hangs from trees by its long rubbery limbs, sleeps 15 hours a day, and it moves. I like the and. So we got parallelism here somewhere. Let me look at E first. It moves. Okay. But what's going on with the rest of that list? Pronouns fine, but we have the sloth does 3 things. It hangs, it sleeps, and it moves. That's not parallel. Verb, verb, pronoun, verb. That's out just on a purely mechanical basis here. A lot of people object to D. I actually kind of fell in love with this question. Love the comment, Shovik. I kind of fell in love with this question. It's kind of a teaching example for my students. This one's been around for a really long time. I want to say it goes back to the 12th edition, 2007-ish, something like that. A lot of people look at this and go, not parallel. The sloth hangs, sleeping, and moving, not parallel. It sounds better, and I actually think this is true. It sounds better to say hangs, sleeps, and moves, or hangs, sleeps, and it moves. Even sounds better to me. Is it okay to say hangs, sleeping, and moving? Well, sure, it just changes the meaning a little bit, not in a bad way. So the sloth hangs by its limbs, its long rubbery limbs, sleeping 15 hours a day and moving. Well, this is just modifying that whole phrase. What's it doing as it hangs from trees by its long rubbery limbs? No, sleeping 15 hours a day. That's describing what it does when it hangs from its long rubbery limbs. And it moves so infrequently that algae grows on its toes. I think I should be a sloth in my next life instead of a GMAT tutor. This is tiring, man. Just kidding. I'm having fun. So that's totally fine. Doesn't sound parallel, but it is. So our answer here is D. And yeah, I'm seeing some really good interpretations of it here. It's like that modifier, those ing modifiers, you can think of it as, well, what's it doing while it hangs from its long rubbery limbs? Or how is it doing it? Or whatever. Like, are we describing more of this? So what is it doing? It's sleeping 15 hours a day and moving infrequently while it hangs by its limbs. It's a modifier. Okay. One more that's kind of pretty foundational, and then I think we'll arguably make it a little harder after this. Okay, so the pronoun here, this question is a little bit more mechanical, I'd probably argue. What I want you to focus on here is that if you like the jargon, demonstrative pronoun, that of, those of, works just like any other pronoun for the most part. That is just a singular pronoun. It has to have a referent. Best way to handle it is to take that and kind of go, all right, let me find out what that refers back to, or what it's making a copy of, if you prefer that, or what it's replacing, and then punch it back in and reread the sentence. That's the only real difference between an it and a that. It has the same basic function. But what I'd like you to be able to do here is just get in the habit of saying, okay, I'm gonna take the that, replace it with the thing it refers back to, and then see if it makes any sense, because we can kind of, I don't know, plays tricks on our ears. I think when I first started grappling with GMAT sentence correction, again, lazy native speaker, no grammar training in English. My grammar training was all in other languages that I tried to learn as second languages or third languages or whatever. So I went off of instinct, and that just never sounded right to me. And then eventually I realized it was right sometimes. So I kind of started ignoring it, and that wasn't right either. And I realized I had to be kind of really mechanical about saying, okay, pronoun, what does it refer back to? Let me punch it in, reread it, see if it makes sense. So we're going to do that with this guy. So we'll pick on the ones with the that of first, and we can look at the others. So A, retail sales rose in August, intensifying expectations that personal spending in that quarter. I just abbreviated it to Q3 here. More than doubled that of the growth rate in personal spending. Okay, so what could that refer to? I'm looking for a singular. That could refer to quarter. That's the nearest one. Let's see if it works. Intensifying expectations that the personal spending in the July-September quarter more than doubled the quarter of the 1.4% growth rate. I'm speaking total nonsense. What about personal spending? That's singular. Intensifying expectations that personal spending in the quarter more than doubled personal spending of the growth rate in personal spending. Still nonsense. So what am I doing here? It's mostly meaning-based, right? There's one little kind of mechanical thing where it's like, it's got to refer to something singular. Let me find the singular, punch it in. That's the mechanical bit. Then you put on your human brain and go, does this make any sense? Personal spending more than doubled the personal spending of the 1.4% growth rate in personal spending. What the heck are we talking about? Utter nonsense. A's out. If we wanted to spend the time, and maybe we do, maybe we don't, I'll go pretty quickly here. Once I see that error with the that of, I'm trying to see if that's repeated anywhere. I've got it in D. Intensifying expectations. I'm going to put this back on the screen. Intensifying expectations of personal spending in the quarter more than doubling personal spending of the growth rate in personal spending. Still nonsense. Intensifying expectations of personal spending in the quarter more than doubling the quarter. Nonsense, right? There is no way out of this. There's nothing it could refer to that makes any sense at all. D is out. E, same deal. Personal spending in the quarter that would more than double whatever, quarter, personal spending, whatever you want it to be, still makes no sense. Very, very quickly, just by applying that little thing with pronouns, we're out of here. We're down to 2, and life is pretty happy. Coming back to those 2. Intensifying expectations that personal spending in B of the quarter would more than double the growth rate. Okay, personal spending would double the growth rate in personal spending. That's pretty good. Intensifying expectations of personal spending. Apologies for the ditto marks. Intensifying expectations that something occurs. So at this point, I'm intensifying our number, I don't even know what we're on, 14. For those of you still watching live, I'm intensifying expectations that I'm going to fall face first in my keyboard. I'm intensifying expectations that something will occur. Am I intensifying expectations of personal spending? You could talk about intensifying expectations of inflation, maybe, of higher inflation, that kind of thing. What does it mean to say expectations of personal spending? Kind of nonsense. Meaning-based thing there in C, one strike against it. I mean, look at that last part. That it more than doubled. I'm super confused by this, that personal spending, I guess that's okay. The it refers to personal spending, but what's the that doing? Intensifying expectations of personal spending that it more than doubled. Is this trying to modify something here? Is it trying to modify July-September quarter? Can't make any sense of that either. So for that reason, C's out. B's our winner. Okay. How are we doing time-wise? I am struggling to keep track of what time we're ending here. Okay, I got about 30, 35 minutes. Let me go ahead here. Okay. Let me jump ahead. Okay. Seems like you guys are doing pretty well on this one. So one of the, I don't know, I guess exciting debates we have on GMAT Club, questions we get all the time, pronoun ambiguity, how much of a problem is it really? Is it something you should be aware of? Absolutely. Is it sometimes a deciding factor on questions? Absolutely, without a doubt. Is it an absolute rule? Not at all. And we're going to talk about that more in the next couple of questions. Here, I'm going to kind of go roughly from kind of worst to best. I'm going to address the if versus whether issue because I don't think you can get away with it or get away from it completely here. So I'm going to start with B. So a proposal has been made to trim the horns from rhinoceros posters. Question is whether tourists will continue to visit game parks to see one. I'm sorry, that's not the one I meant to go after. Yeah, to see one once their horns are trimmed. I'm struggling a little bit with this to C1, that's the rhino. And then I got the there here. Look, is it the end of the world? Do I kind of know that it's their horns is the rhino? Is that pretty clear to me? Yeah, most people don't have horns. Maybe after 14 hours of either teaching GMAT lessons or watching them, you feel like you have horns or feel like there's horns in your eyes, or you wish there was a pointy horn in your eye because you just want to go to bed. But tourists don't have horns, and it causes just enough confusion that I look at B and kind of go, that's not ideal. Now look, in isolation, do I cross it out? Do I say this is absolutely wrong? No. Because sometimes you can get away with that ambiguity. Let's say that the other four all have absolutely heinous errors, then no problem. But that's not the deal here. When you look at the other options we have much better ones, right? So again, we can argue about kind of, is this horrible? There, we've got rhinos, tourists. I think B is worse than A in terms of that pronoun ambiguity. Legitimately unclear in B. You can figure it out, but legitimately not good because there seems to be referring to the singular here. I know the rhinos are way back there somewhere. Problem. Here, is this terrible? No. Tourists visit game parks after their horns are trimmed. Whose horns are we talking about? Obviously, the rhinos. It's pretty close, not a big deal. But wouldn't it be nicer if we do what we get in C here, where it just eliminates all doubt? Crystal clear, good. Totally clear here. The animal's horns have been trimmed. Absolutely no doubt. No reason to have to worry about it and go, well, what does that one mean? No hesitation. That's better. You got some other minor issues in here. Whether tourists will visit game parks and see rhinos. So the tourists are doing two things, visiting game parks, and tourists are also seeing rhinos. That sounds good. Sounds parallel. It is parallel. The question is, should it be? I would argue that it shouldn't, because then it sounds like it's kind of two equal weight actions that are separate from each other. So tourists visit game parks over here, and then they go see rhinos over there in a zoo, not necessarily in the same place. That's the issue there. So not ideal because of that. We could argue that the pronoun ambiguity is a minor issue, relatively speaking, but between that and the visit game parks and C, A is definitely inferior to C. B also even more inferior to C, because that pronoun, I think, is legitimately causing confusion there. All right, D. If tourists will, and I'm going to skip C for a second, that's looking pretty good. If tourists will visit game parks and C, again, doesn't really make a lot of sense because it sounds like those things are equal weight. And that's where one of the things I keep saying, you can't totally separate mechanics from meaning. Yes, I'm looking for easy ways to eliminate. I'm looking for things that are efficient eliminations, but it's never totally divorced from meaning. Thank you, Shobik. So never totally divorced from meaning, right? So here, parallel, not grammatically wrong by any means, but it also doesn't make sense. Why are we talking about it that way? Why are we saying that tourists will visit game parks and tourists over there are going to go see rhinos? Nonsense. I'm good here with the once the animal's horns are trimmed. I'm totally comfortable in this case saying that D is inferior to C. I know what some of you guys are going to ask because it came up earlier. The if versus whether thing. I kind of dodged it in an earlier lesson. I can't remember which one it came up in, but I was trying to focus on the parallelism or whatever we were talking about there. If is used for conditional statements. So if one thing occurs, then some other thing will occur. That's not the case here. We're talking about sort of a choice of not a conditional thing where if something occurs, something else will. It's just kind of an almost neither or, right? So either tourists do this or they don't do it. In that case, whether is more appropriate. The really slash and burn way to handle this, it does not show up that often. It's kind of a quirk. There's a couple of questions I really like for other reasons where we happen to have if or whether in there. It really doesn't show up on the test as often as I'm kind of making it seem today. But kind of the shorthand for it is just to say, look, if you have a choice between if and whether, as long as whether makes sense, go with the whether. This is not a conditional statement. You shouldn't be using if here. But if that's something you don't want to think about, I am totally fine with that. Does whether make sense? Yep. Then you shouldn't use if. And I'm totally fine with that. It's not an important enough issue to go a whole lot deeper than that. So hopefully that's clear enough there. So for that reason, you could just eliminate D and E. And E really has nothing wrong with it other than the if. Really, the only difference between C and E is that if. So it does become a significant factor. C is your issue. And again, this is where we get into that, kind of, I don't know, that kind of Weasley area of how big of a deal is pronoun ambiguity. Something to pay attention to, but I'm not obliterating even B, I'm not knocking it out in isolation. I'm only knocking it out because I know I've got a much better choice that's much clearer. Okay. That's that one. Now we're going to get into good stuff. This is good. This lesson's going along pretty quickly. Can you guys believe I've only had 1 cup of coffee? 10 o'clock p.m. here in Denver. Started at 8:30 this morning. Was up at 5:30. 1 cup of coffee. 17 cups of tea. 1 cup of coffee. Heirloom tomatoes. This is my favorite. I'm going to list one on the screen because I was too lazy to write this out. So the reason I brought this question up, it's not because this is necessarily such a great question, such a hard one. Again, I'm not seeing a lot of struggles in the live group, which doesn't shock me at all. You could almost kind of go through this one and just kind of just intuit your way through it and go, well, I read A and I just can't make a lot of sense of it, right? Like, I don't think we need to get super mechanical, and I'm going to go through this one pretty quickly because I'm not seeing the struggles in the live group. Plenty of explanations of this on GMAT Club if you have more questions on it. So I'm going to be pretty quick with it. The reason I want to bring it up is specifically the pronoun issue here. Very, very stripped down version that I've written up on the board. Heirloom tomatoes only look less appetizing than their supermarket cousins, and they, whatever. So this falls into the category of things that, I've handled a little bit too rigidly in the past. Here's how I think about this. Ambiguity. Is this they ambiguous? Well, number one, ambiguity is never an absolute rule. Can it be a deciding factor? It can be, but am I automatically crossing this out because I'm not clear what they refers to? They could refer to the cousins. They could refer to the heirloom tomatoes, the round and red supermarket cousins. Maybe that's ambiguous and a problem. Now, as I look at this, and by the way, this is the same thing, really all of them that have a they in it. So C, D, and E. But D and E in particular are the ones I want to focus on here, where you kind of get the cousins, which I can't spell anymore. And then you get the they, same thing, cousins, semicolon, they. My interpretation of this question, there's a few others out there like this. My interpretation of this used to be that, well, this is an exception to the ambiguity rule, because what we have right here, this is the beginning of a new clause. So beginning of a brand new independent clause, this is the subject. Subject number 2, pronoun. Subject number 1, pronoun, noun. In all likelihood here, that they can refer back to that subject and it doesn't violate the ambiguity rule. That's what I've said in the past, or variations of that. And I actually think that what I just said, there's a lot wrong with it. First of all, ambiguity is not a rule at all, people. It just isn't. And I think it's really tempting to think of it that way. It is a thing to be hyper aware of. It's a thing to pay attention to. It is not an absolute. When it's more confusing than another option, yeah, if that's the last thing you have to go off of, that last question we did with the rhinos, yeah, you bet it's significant there. It's not the only factor, but it's significant because you have some answer choices where that ambiguity really kind of creates a bit of confusion. You got to hesitate a little bit and go, wait, whose horns? And then there's another option where it's crystal clear. I'd rather take crystal clear anytime over muddy, as long as there's nothing else going on. But I don't want you to get in the habit of looking at this and going, this is ambiguous, really, ever. I'm going to cross that automatically. That's thought one. So referring to ambiguity is a rule. Problem. Second, I don't think that it always has to be the case that they refers, so the subject of the second clause, does it always have to refer back to this? And maybe I have said this correctly in the past, where it doesn't have to, but it certainly can. I see that as an area where I think the ambiguity is less of an issue. I would actually stand by that. I think when you see two clauses like this, full clause and full clause again, I think it's kind of a natural place to look. It kind of feels like it's totally reasonable, but it's like, okay, subject of the sentence, heirloom tomatoes, subject of the second, clause in this case, might also be heirloom tomatoes. That doesn't feel uncomfortable at all, right? Like that seems very, very reasonable. It's a reasonable place to look. Doesn't mean that it has to. The they doesn't have to refer back to heirloom tomatoes, but I don't have a problem with this. So I don't mean to say that it's an exception to a rule, because it's not exactly that. There's no rule in the first place. But I think it is worth acknowledging that, yeah, when it's kind of subject referring back to a previous subject, that's kind of where our eyes and our brains go anyway. So not a big problem here. So I don't have an issue with the they. And I don't want to spend any more time on this question because I want to get to the next couple. Again, live crowd, you're spoken this one, not having any issues. And most of this kind of gets into, yeah, some of these are just messy and the modifiers are all goofy. My point here is I don't want you to look at this and get rigid about the ambiguity, because it is a very natural place to look. Second clause starts with a pronoun, very likely refers back to that first subject, no problem. So don't get too rigid about that. And yeah, I think that makes it even more acceptable. It just feels like a really natural way to refer back. But instead of this referring back to some random noun later in the sentence, subject to subject seems reasonable. I'm going to give this a little more latitude. And it does turn out that the right answer is one of the ones with this pronoun that's referring back to something way, way back there, but subject to subject. Okay. Next one. I've been waiting to do this one for a while. I'm excited. All right, loving this, seeing some disagreement. It's a great discussion. I've been spellbound by the discussion, haven't written anything on the board, not going to, hands getting tired. Hour number 14. So I kind of love this question because I think the natural thing to do with GMAT sentence correction. So if I took let's say really smart people here, like Shovik, who's watching, and said, okay, I want you to spend a whole lot of time kind of taking the GMAT and figuring out what the rules are for it. And that's basically what test prep people do, right? Like we kind of go around, we spend our careers kind of, teaching people this stuff, and you have conversations about it, and kind of see, how do we learn about the GMAT? Sure, we go take the test. But we also just kind of look at everything that's published and kind of derive the rules from that. It's not like there's any definitive guide to the English language that the GMAT's working off of. We kind of infer what those rules are that they enforce. And what I think we want to provide to students is we want to be able to say, hey guys, your life's going to be better. You memorize these 20 things. It's going to be glorious. Here's how to think about pronouns. So the kinds of things that I've certainly said in the past, and I think I've really worked to not be rigid about this stuff. But things I've said in the past, yeah, ambiguity, not an absolute rule. Okay, great. I think I had that right from the start. But one of the things I said is that a non-possessive pronoun can't refer back to a possessive. So look at D here. The kind of thing I've said in the past is I think what the GMAT's doing typically is that it's saying that a non-possessive pronoun, so a subject pronoun. So as you look at D, she was considered the better poet. One of the things I was saying based on all of the questions that had been released up until a few years ago was it can't refer to the possessive Elizabeth Barrett Browning's success. That's clearly wrong. And it's one of those things that we kind of looked at a bunch of questions where that seemed to be something they were enforcing. And we overdid it. That is absolutely not a rule. And I'm not sure what ever was. That was kind of test prep folks. I'm not the only one trying to read the tea leaves and being too rigid about it. So I'm actually seeing people in the live chat bringing that up. Non-possessive pronoun can't refer back to a possessive. It's not that common. It's really hard for me to point to really anything beyond this question. Maybe there's one other one where it happens. It's very, very rare. But is it inherently wrong? No, not in real life, certainly. And GMAT's telling us it's not wrong here either. Okay, so what is this about? Let's get to the question itself. A, although she was considered among her contemporaries to be the better poet than her husband, later Elizabeth Barrett Browning was overshadowed by his success. Whole bunch of issues here. They're not necessarily that heinous. But you add them all up, and we got something that's not great here. Although she was considered among her contemporaries to be the better poet than her husband. What? It'd be fine to say the best poet, a better poet than her husband, but that article's awfully weird there. The better poet than her husband gets the comparison wrong. I don't like the placement of later. I'm not saying it's a smoking gun, but it's not great. Later, Browning was overshadowed by his success. Here's the big thing here. I'm not sure I would necessarily overreact to this, but I know we have better options. She was overshadowed by his success. I think it would make sense to say that she was overshadowed by him, that her career was overshadowed by his career. Her success was overshadowed by his success. I'm not sure we'd say that a person is overshadowed by somebody else's success. That doesn't make a ton of sense. If you want to be conservative, you keep it in. I'll spoil the surprise in the interest of time and say we're going to have better options here in a minute. And we can argue that B might be one of them. So although Elizabeth Barrett Browning was considered among her contemporaries as a better poet than her husband, she was later overshadowed by his success. I think this one sounds better. was considered among her contemporaries as a better poet than her husband. She was overshadowed by his success. Same exact issue there. She was overshadowed by the success. That's not great meaning wise. Again, if you want to be conservative, you can keep it in. Other issue here, considered as a better poet. The stronger idiom there is considered a better poet. Is this a smoking gun? We can argue. One of the things that's come up a few times here. Again, I'm going to go ahead and I'll keep it in just to be sporting because I'm seeing a lot of people pick B in the live crowd. One of the things that comes up here is how much did you care about idioms? I've had that question pop up a few times tonight. It should be one of your very last resorts. If you're certain that an idiom is wrong, great, run with it. If you're certain that the idiom doesn't make sense, great, you can cross it out. There's something like 25,000 idioms in English. Good luck to you. No point in learning them. There's lists of idioms in some of the test prep books. I wouldn't spend a moment of time on it. Very, very hard to find questions where it's going to completely hinge on an idiom. Don't waste too much time with it. I'll hang on to B to be sporting. C, later overshadowed by the success of her husband. Her poetry, okay, now that's way off. Her poetry is overshadowed later by the success of her husband. Her poetry is overshadowed by success. That's nonsense. Had been considered among her contemporaries to be better than that of her husband. What's the that of doing there in C? Was considered to be better than, her poetry was better than the poetry of her husband. I guess that's fine. But I think that later overshadowed by the success of her husband, her poetry, total nonsense. C's out. D, does it sound great? Her success was later overshadowed by the success of her husband, punching in for the that of in D. Great. Elizabeth Barrett Browning's success was later overshadowed by the success of her husband. Apples to apples, nice clean comparison. Among her contemporaries, she was considered the better poet. No issues there at all. Unless you make the mistake that I've made in the past, obsessing over that possessive, and that's not an issue. And obviously at this point, we can see that D is better than B. The comparison makes a lot more sense. Meaning is much clearer here. And then E, Elizabeth Barrett Browning's poetry was considered among her contemporaries as better than her husband. Her poetry is better than her husband. Might be true, but it's not something that would make sense to talk about in a sentence like this. E is out. D's our winner. Let's race through one more. Which one do I want to do here? Ooh, one of my favorites. Okay. We'll see if we can get through this in 6 minutes. This is fun. You guys are getting punchy in the chat. It makes me happy. Okay, all about the pronouns here, but some subtle stuff going on. And this is one of my favorite teaching examples as well. I'm not quite sure why this is buried in getting in MBA programs, but I think it's a fun question if you're going to get better at sentence correction. So one thing, I'm seeing a lot of this in the chat, people are noticing, one of the big keys here, starfish, is that singular or plural? Well, it depends, right? Not uncommon. There's a few questions that use words like data. We typically use data now as singular. A lot of people are going to argue it's the plural of datum. What's the GMAT doing? It just depends on the question. I don't think they have a rule for it, but I'm looking for a clue in the question if it's an ambiguous noun that could operate as singular or plural. Deer, media, data, starfish. Starfish is singular or plural here. They tell you. If there's any ambiguity about that, the GMAT's going to tell you exactly what it is. Starfish have. Starfish or plural in this particular concept. And I agree with you, Shovik. I do not like the word datum, but some people, academics often argue. I had some professors in PhD school who were like, oh no, data's plural. We talk about the data are, and if you're talking about one piece of data, it's datum. Weird. Anyway, A, one arm is lost. It quickly replaces it. We can debate whether the repeated it referring to different things is a problem. That's actually something that comes up quite a bit in the forums. People will ask, can I use the same pronoun twice in the same sentence to refer to different things? Context dependent. I don't think it's an absolute rule that that's a problem inherently. If it causes confusion, you might have an issue. I don't want you to be too rigid about it. But here, obviously, the issue is the it has to be starfish, but we know that starfish is plural, so A is out. B, if one arm is lost, it is quickly replaced. Now we've gone passive voice, it is replaced. But at least that makes sense because the it is referring to the one arm. That's good. With the animal sometimes overcompensating, growing an extra one or two. Okay, cool. That's not bad. I don't have any issues there, at least not yet. Maybe I'll see something better. C, they lose one arm. They quickly replace it. Lots kind of not great here. So they lose one arm. So they collectively, the starfish collectively lose a single arm. That doesn't make any sense at all when you think about it logically. On that base alone, because I got B that's pretty good here, and we're also running out of time. I'm going to get rid of C. I can say the same thing about D. They lose one arm collectively. They lose one arm. They are quickly replaced. Now we're replacing the starfish. The starfish lose one arm collectively, and then the starfish get replaced. Nonsense. D's out. E. They lose one arm. It is quickly replaced. Again, same issue. The they and the one arm. Don't love it. The it is okay here, but we can get rid of it for that reason. All right. B's our answer. Pronouns. Lots of fun. Lots of subtlety to it. Don't get too rigid, you guys. All right. Bottom of the hour is here. Thank you for surviving hour number 14 with me. We'll see you in the next hour.